Hello, welcome to my blog. My name is Tom Shue, and today I want to talk to you about the histogram. The histogram is a graphical representation of the information that has hit your sensor. Some people will tell you that you can use the histogram to evaluate exposure, and they're right, you can evaluate exposure with it, but you cannot set your exposure based on the histogram. And I'll tell you why. First of all, let's go into a little bit about the histogram and what actually it is and how do you use it. In your camera, you'll notice that there's a couple histograms. One is an RGB histogram, your red, green, and blue. And as you know, the red, green, and blue are the primary colors that allow us to create any combination of colors. So this is going to tell you information for color and where those channels are falling, and also there's a gray bar or gray boxes on your camera, and that's going to tell you your illumination or your luminance histogram. The histogram is broken up into 255 separate areas. 255 is white and 0 is black. The way middle value is, or center proper exposure, works off of a middle gray. In digital world it's 12%, in film it's 18%. I just use 18% because I'm stuck on film. However, if you're working in Lightroom, it's not 0 to 255, it's 0 to 100, and 50 would represent that 18% gray, or that middle exposure, or that middle value, or middle gray. It's all based on the middle. Inside of your camera viewfinder, you'll notice there's a 0 in the center, and then there's -3 and +3. Those represent stops of exposure under and over, but that 0 center point is that same exact 0 center point in Lightroom that says 50%, and it's that same 18% center point in film, and it's that same 12% in digital. It's all based on that center point. Okay, so now that we know about that, let's talk about the information that's in a file and the file size, how that relates to the file size. If you capture an image which they say exposed to the right, let's pull up an image. This image, if you look at it, you can see that it was just exposed at the center inside the viewfinder, and the file is, not really a large file. It's not a small file, but it's not a large file. If you were to take an image, make an image with all of the exposure to the right, you'll notice that the file size is a lot bigger. And the reason why is there's a lot more information in the file than there is if you shoot it to the left or in the center. So let's go into the develop module. We're going to hit the D key. And if we were to slide this over, if you look at quickly in Lightroom, let me back up here. If you are to hover areas inside the histogram, you can use this to actually manipulate exposure. If you look down here where it says ISO 400, you'll notice it says blacks, shadows, exposure, highlights, and whites. Okay, so this is kind of a great tool for roughing in an image. So when they say exposed to the right, what they're saying is, without clipping your highlights, push all of the information in the scene to the right. Okay, so we turn on our highlight warning. We got a little bit of clipping here, so we'll call that fine. Okay, if you look at the file size when you take a picture of this versus a file size that looks like this, let's pull this back over an exposure, you'll see that the file size is considerably smaller than a file size that is exposed to the right. And this is the reason why. Let me pull this over here. In your sensor and the algorithms that capture information, 90% of the, let's say 80%, let me rephrase, the 80% of the file that's created is from information that's captured in this area. And then it cuts in half each time you bracket over. So it'll be 80 and 40 and 20 and 10 and 5. So each one of these areas right here break out the information exponentially smaller. Okay, so when you expose to the right, you're doing so knowing that you're going to post-process the image. Okay, so you're trying to capture as much information as you can inside the file so that later on in post work you can pull that information out. Okay, so let's do that real quick, and we'll use the histogram as a reference. So You can pull the exposure slider and fix your blacks here and use the highlight warnings to fix it, but I like to do it a little different. So I'll turn on my warnings. Actually, I'll turn them off. We don't even need them. If you hold the Alt key, you'll notice it says Reset Tone. You can reset a whole box of information if you've made changes. Say, for example, if I hold the Alt key and I hit Reset, it's going to bring everything back to 0. Right? Well, we don't want that. Let's go back to where we were to the right. So if you hit Control Z, it will back up to where you were before. So we hold the Alt key, and we're going to bring our exposure over so we're not clipping anything. And you see all that area there? That's white. It's being clipped. So we're going to slide this down to the center where it's not clipping. Okay? We're going to do the same thing with our highlights. Alt. So we're not clipping anything there. We're good there. So let's give ourselves a black. What we want to do to create a rich image is we want to have a black point and we need to have a white point. It's called setting the white and black points. So we hold the Alt key down and we bring this over. We know that there's some black in those street lamps, so we'll just bring this up until we have some black in the street lamps. Okay, so now let's go a little bit more. Okay, so now we have some black here, 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 and here. Okay. Now let's do the same thing for our white point. Let's bring this up until we have a white. We know that curb right here is where the sun's hitting, and I don't want to make that completely white, but we'll start to make it whiter. There it is right there. It's starting to come in and it's starting to turn white. Okay, so now if we look at the image now, you'll see that it's a lot richer than it was before. So we exposed to the right in the camera and we fixed it, and if you look at the histogram, it's a little different than when we captured the image, and this is all where we get to using the histogram to judge exposure. You can judge it, but to create exposure, it's subjective. You and only you know when you have the proper exposure. Now when you're dealing with skin tones and things, it's a little different, but in this image I know that the saturation is a little too much, and if you look at blacks and whites, look at the saturation and how it increases with more black. Contrast also does saturation. So the more you put contrast, the more saturation you'll get. So let's look at this again, our black point, and let's look at the shadows. Let's see where we're at here. So we'll bring this shadow detail slider till it's just barely clipping. Okay, and if you see what happens in the histogram when we hold our Alt key under each one of these sliders, so it's the same thing as just grabbing this up here and doing it. So if you wanted to turn on your highlight warnings and go in here your blacks, you'll look at the blue area that's coming on the screen right here. Instead of holding the Alt key, I like doing the Alt key because it reverses it and I can really get more control, because there's so much small information when you do it like this. So you can do it up here with the histogram. However, I don't like to do that. So let's move to a different image. Matter of fact, let me fix the saturation real quick. So if you come down here to HSL, well, let me turn it back on. Drop down HSL, and you grab this guy here, and I wanted to change the saturation on that green. I can just drag it down, and I can fix the green lawn, and I can fix the blue sky however I like, more or less saturation. And this is all subjective based on what I want the image to look like. So we're going to call this image done. Let's go here to the grid, G, and let's pull up an image with some skin tone. So if we look at this image, the histogram shows that it's terrible, that this can't be a good image, when in fact it's a great image. The skin tone is perfect. You can only evaluate exposure with a light meter. Chimping will get you so far, but if you want consistent frame to frame color and skin tones, you have to use a light meter, and you have to create a custom white balance. So if you look at her skin, her face, her colors, and the blacks in her dress, they're not clipped. The exposure is perfect. Even, you know, in the shadow area, there's detail in the dress. This is a proper exposure, and the histogram cannot help you. So hopefully I've showed you a few things about the histogram you didn't know, and why it's so important to use a light meter, and why exposure is subjective. Thanks for visiting my blog. I appreciate your time, and we'll talk to you soon.